The word darkness is something that I want to focus on today. Not because that's what is the most important thing to us, but because we need to know why we need the light to shine upon us. That we are all in need of the light to make its dwelling among us, not to merely shine upon us and say, this is what's wrong with you, but to be with us, in us, surround us, and engulf us into his righteousness. The darkness here is none other than moral darkness. There are many darkness in the world, namely that we struggle with pandemic, we struggle with poverty, we struggle with crime and injustice in the world. And of course, Jesus and God cares about all of those darknesses, and that they need to be solved and they need to be answered. Whether, again, crime, poverty, injustice, environmental issues, and pandemic, all of these things need to be solved. And these are part of the darknesses that we experience. But the darkness that the scripture is addressing and getting us to look at today is moral darkness. And in many ways, if you think about the darknesses that we experience, you'll realize that they're a moral issue. Environmental issue is not the issue of unwanted gases floating or chemicals flooding our streams, but it's really the moral issues of our time. And the poverty also is not just lack of money and lack of food, because there's enough of that to go around in the world if we all decided to share. Did you know that if Christians practice 10%, if every Christian in the world decided to give 10% of their earning, that there will be no poverty in the world, that those issues will just in that moment be solved. Yet we have all of these issues, not because we lack the resources, not because we somehow have too much toxic gases or chemicals, because there's moral darkness in the world, that we want to overproduce. We want to practice unsustainable lifestyle, that we want to hold on to the things that we have so that we can have more of what we have next year. So it is fitting that Jesus is shining the light upon the moral darkness of the world rather than economic and ecological conditions of our time. There are obvious moral darknesses that we all see and that we can easily identify and say that is wrong. Stealing is wrong. Lying and cheating and stepping on people to get ahead in life is wrong. Murder is wrong. And there are many obvious things where we say, I don't do those things, and I immediately identify those things as being wrong. But there's also another type of moral darkness that you and I do not see. One is that there are comfort that we feel with certain sins of our lives. It says here in the scripture that the light is visiting those who sit in the darkness and shadow of death. The word sitting is not a passive sitting as you and I would understand today, that somehow we got stuck there and we're just sort of helplessly, powerlessly sitting in the darkness. The word setting is the language of the Psalms and of the Old Testament, where a ruler, a king, someone of power and influence will sit in their sin and tell everyone what to do. The seat is seat of power. The seat is seat of ruling. That we are sitting in our sin and we are comfortable with the sins that we commit. And that is the issue, and that is the problem that we are facing today, that we're not just sinning, but that we are comfortable in our sins, and we have made peace with lies and falsehoods, and we have made peace with not reconciling with people, and we have made peace with gossiping and strife, and we have made peace with not knowing, with the culture that we live in, and we say we will follow what you have defined to be normal in my life. There's yet another moral darkness. There's ones that are obvious, ones that are not so obvious. And the third one is that we do not trust God. We think of moral darkness as doing something wrong, doing something that is not acceptable, and doing something that people frown and shun. But I want you to know that moral darkness, the greatest moral darkness that leads to shadow of death, is the one where you say, there is no God and I don't trust him. And this is not just for the atheist. The Christians too live in practical atheism, where we by name live as Christians, that where we by practice and behavior act like Christians, but in our own private life, we're no better than atheists. We do not trust him. We do not consult him. We don't look to him and turn to him and say, what is it that you want me to sacrifice? Is there a place where I need to turn the other cheek? Is there a place where I need to give in order so that someone else may live their life in prosperity and abundance? I will get more into not trusting in God, but there is moral darkness that you and I have about our self-identity, that we want to be like the culture. And there's moral darkness that we have where we are committing sins that are obvious to us, but at some point we have become too comfortable with it. There are three ways in which you and I deal with moral darkness. And there are more ways. There's more ways than these three, but these three are what I would consider three dominant ways that we deal with moral darkness. One is that we deal with our moral darkness, that you recognize that there's something wrong with you, and you want to get rid of that shadow of death in your life. And we deal with it with religion. We believe in the right things, we say the right things, and we do the religious things, but there's a problem. Did you know that the story of prodigal son, the story where the youngest son takes all the inheritance that belongs to him and takes it and leaves his home and spends all of his money on parties and drinking until he runs out of money and he has to eat pig's food in a faraway land. And the story, you're familiar with it, but let me just quickly explain it to you, to those of you who are not familiar. He decides to come back home because he is impoverished. And at home, he finds his father who's been waiting for him all along. And there, the father welcomes him, brings reconciliation. But he finds out that his older brother, who stayed home and who worked very hard, he does not welcome his brother back. He is bitter that he had to work hard while his younger brother squandered his inheritance away. And he feels that the younger brother does not belong in the home, that he does not deserve to be a son, that he does not deserve all this party and then the robe and the rings and love and the lavish forgiveness and grace that he has experienced. What Jesus is talking about there is that the older son is a Pharisee of Jesus' time. Pharisee in Jesus' time are those who are religious. They dealt with the moral darkness by being super religious, and the religiosity has come upon them, and they are being holy and self-righteous by being a religious person and doing all these religious activities. Their light is like a spotlight, where they're saying, I don't know what this light is all about, but I want the light to shine upon me. No one else, just on me. I want everyone to see how holy I am. I want everyone to see how I am praying and fasting and how I have memorized the scripture. Just look at me. But here's the thing. If you are dealing with your moral darkness today through being more religious, being more religiously active, what you will recognize, what you will inevitably end up is that you will have the spotlight upon you and say, I have the light and no one else as the light. You will break your peace and your fellowship with your brothers and sisters around you because you are the only one who is holy and who is righteous above everyone and anyone else. You're breaking peace with your brothers and sisters, and now because of that, you're breaking peace with God. Only peace that you have is with yourself, where you say, I am good, I am morally upright, and I don't need anything else. If you deal with moral darkness, with religiosity, you will inevitably break your fellowship with your brothers and sisters and ultimately with God. There's a second way people try to shine light on their moral darkness, and that is through moral secularism. I know that's a big word, and I know it's something that we don't talk about, and I don't pretend to be an expert or someone who is well-versed in all of this, but this is what it basically means. Moral secularism is saying that I can be a moral person, I can be a good person without God or help of God, and I can do all of these things. I can overcome my temptations. And I know what good is, I know what right is without help of God. And actually, it says that a moral secularist would say, you are a fool and you have a problem if you need God to tell you what is right and what is wrong. You should know that already because you can determine what is right and you can determine what is good. You don't need God, and we can achieve all of these things without help of any religion or any sacred books. Therefore, cooperation is good because it promotes human flourishing. Love is good because it promotes human flourishing. The greatest value in secular humanism is that do whatever promotes human flourishing, whatever makes our society better, whatever makes our society prosper and become better today and tomorrow. But I want you to look at that. If you can achieve good and righteousness without Christ, without having the light visit you and shine upon you, and you can achieve human flourishing apart from God, what are you really saying? What is it that you are actually saying to yourself? You're really saying, as long as we appeal to our selfishness, that I'm loving you today because it is good for me, that I can flourish more than if I hate you and if I murder you and I kill you. I'm loving you today. I'm reconciling with you, not because it's sin not to do so. It is not because God is the ultimate judge of all things, but I will accomplish these things because if I do that, I will flourish. And that's the biggest motivation. That kind of light is too brittle. It's too thin. To really live our life and practice what we consider to be good because it is beneficial for me is ultimately, at the end of the day, you're being selfish. Another problem with moral secularism is that culture tells you different things about what is good, and we cannot agree on these things. I'll give you an example from our modern day. I won't go into a whole history of how culture redefines morality. One day, behavior A is good, but in another time, same behavior is considered utterly immoral, and vice versa. Let me tell you, today we're suffering with coronavirus. And in our moral secularism, one of the highest moral value is human rights, that every humans have rights, that is inalienable, that is due upon us, and we must enjoy these human rights. And I agree with you that we have human rights, that we have rights to enjoy our life, rights to speech, right to freedom of religion, and right to protest, etc. But the limitation of human rights can clearly be seen in today as people say, I have rights not to wear a mask. You can't tell me to wear a mask because it is my right to choose. Government has no say in what I do or what I don't do about how I cover myself. And many people made an argument that that is against my human rights and I have right to choose. And people are protesting all over North America saying that I do not have to cover myself. I won't get into the whole argument, and maybe you feel that way too, I don't know. But I'm just merely pointing out the fact that under moral secularism, there are places in which human logic fails. And we don't know exactly what is right and who is right. In moral secularism, we break peace with ourselves and with each other, and ultimately with God as well. But there's then now what? What is the third way that we deal with the darkness, us sitting in the shadow of death? The third way is that it is Christ as the light. That we deal with our moral darkness through Christ. Think about this. God is sending Christ into the world, not only as light, but as a covenant sacrifice. And that's another big sort of theological jargon. But basically, as we have been journeying through the Old Testament, you see that when God makes a covenant, when God makes a promise, that there has to be a sacrifice. There has to be blood that needs to be shed. And that is because there is no blood connection between God and us. We're not family. You don't see anywhere in the Bible in history, in Middle Eastern setting, where a father would cut a covenant with his son or with his daughter because they are blood. There is blood between them. So you don't see Abraham making a promise, a covenant with his son. That you don't see Isaac when he blessed Jacob, that he's not cutting a covenant because they are blood. When God sent his son to give us the promise of salvation, promise of reconciliation and peace, his son was the covenantal sacrifice because our relationship with God was broken. That he is giving light to us, not by saying, you must be good, or I'm coming to see who has been good and who is good enough. But he is saying, no one is good enough. And I'm giving light even to those who are sitting in the darkness and shadow of death by giving my son so that I may cut an eternal covenant with you, so that you will be forgiven and that you will receive salvation. Covenant with God turns us into a child of God. Just like in the story of prodigal son, we are this younger son who is returning back to the tender mercy of his father. In God's version of prodigal son, where a younger son takes all the inheritance and leaves home, the father sends his older son to get his younger brother who ran away and who is suffering. And the older brother comes in search of his younger brother, and he commits himself into the pigsty in place of his younger son, so that he may go back home and enjoy all the inheritance that belonged to him. Do you see how the difference is between the way that the world and religious people try to get the light versus how God shines his light? God shines his light into us by saying, live and think and behave as my child. Live your life as my child who is reconciled back into the home, who will enjoy all the inheritance of peace and trust and dependence upon what the Father has. Now let's see what this looks like in practical. And practically, what does this look like? It means this. You have peace with yourself. If you have Christ in you, and if Christ is a light in your life, you have peace with yourself because you are no longer worried about your future. That the Father, he has sovereignty over your life, and you will not fret or live in fear about your future. Even though you may lack certain things today, you know that the Father has you in his hands. And because of that freedom, because of that trust, it opens up your today, the way that you live your life. If somebody backstabs you because they're gossiping about you and because they feel inferior to you and they have this ego trip and they're taking it out on you, because you have trust in God and you have dependence on God, you will not lash out like you did before. If you see somebody in financial need today, you will not think twice and say, I cannot give anything to you, although you are in need, because if I give this to you, I might lack something today or tomorrow. Because you are a child, you say, Father knows what I need even before I ask. You see that? That's the moral light that we lack. And we can't get to that moral light if you don't see God as your Father. Unless you believe that God has cut covenant with you through the blood and the sacrifice his son, you cannot make this kind of moral light into yourself. A lot of us deal with the lack of self-esteem and self-worth because we feel that we lack something. But if you know that you are a child of God and that is your identity and that is your faith today and that is what you see and that is the light that is in you, that you don't compare yourself to the beauty of the world. The beauty that the world says you must be beautiful, you must be successful, you must be something before you can say to yourself, you are worth anything. You say, no, I do not buy into those lies. That's false truth. This culture says that is the truth, but it's false truth. I am a child of God, and my worth is not dependent upon that. And you know this, hopefully from your own life. If not, and if you're a parent today, in the way that you raise your children, that you don't give them their worth based on their looks, their intelligence. The number of meals that they get in the day is not dependent on their grades. That if they get anything less than A+, they get one meal less. That they will know and they will feel through the silence and awkwardness in the room that they're not accepted because they don't know how to tie their shoes or didn't put their socks on time or go to bed on time. This is not how you and I were treated. And this is not how we want to raise our children, whether you have them now or one day you will have them. Just in that way, when you have God in your life and you believe that you are a child of God, the way that you think about yourself and the way that you think about others in your life, everybody else in your life, whether if they're Christians, then they're brothers and sisters, that you have peace with them because you want to reconcile with them. You would never write off your brothers and sisters. So you want to reconcile and you want to treat them differently. And when people are morally less than you, let's say, you would not write them off because God has cut covenant with the world, with those who are sitting in the darkness. So you would want to reach out to them. You would never feel smug and say, I don't want you around me and I don't want you around my family. That you would reach out to them and you would shine the same light that God has shined upon you. So brothers and sisters, as we see the light shining, the light visiting upon us, we see that religion cannot do it. The moral righteousness of secular moralists cannot do it. But only through Christ do we see ourselves as his children and begin to make choices in our life about ourselves and others through that covenant of mercy, that we are his children and that we are his child. Let me ask you then, do you see yourself predominantly as God's child today? Or do you see yourself as a Pharisee, someone who needs to be morally good and keep trying to be good? How does being a child of God change your outlook on your self-worth, about wealth? How does this shape the way that you feel about your future? Do you trust that the Father knows what you need even before you ask him? And how does this impact your relationship with others in the church and in the workplace or at school? Do you still feel that you're morally superior and you feel smug about yourself and that you look down upon those who are, for whatever reasons, financially, morally, or socioeconomically, that you feel that they're less and you look down upon them? Or do you see them as brothers and sisters and someone that needs the light of Christ just in the way that you once were blind, but now you see, in the same way that you were once lost, but now you are found? God shined light in our darkness, in our moral darkness. And when you see the light, there we will find some answers to the poverty of our world, to ecological problems of our time. And we will find solutions to the anxieties and the depressions that we feel about ourselves because we measure our worth by the eyes of the culture, the darkness of the culture. If the light is in us, then we are his children and God becomes our Father. If the light is in us, the future is not in my hands, but in God's. If we believe that the only true light is from Christ, then that means no other thing than that we are forgiven and we are adopted into his household, and all the riches of his house, all the inheritance that is Christ, love, joy, faithfulness, trust, and dependence upon God is now all ours unreservedly. The Father sent his Son to rescue us from our eternal condemnation. He gave all to us to cut the covenant with us when there was no blood tie between us, when there was no way for God to give us all the inheritance and all the blessings. He sent and gave his Son to us that we may experience all the forgiveness and riches that God the Father has in store for us. I pray that through this Christmas, through Christ, that you will see the light and that you will get up and walk away from the darkness and come into the light. Just as he has put the light into you, may you walk in the light. May he make your path straight. And may you experience his tender compassion. And may you hear his beckoning call, searching for you to redeem you, to free you from your own prison of darkness.